They never said, "I love you," but they never slept apart again. The flower dust hung in the air like a fine white ghost, illuminated by the single shaft of amber light that managed to pierce through the high, narrow window of the kitchen. Martha worked the dough with a rhythmic, heavy exhaustion, her palms pressing into the wooden board with a sound like a slow, wet heartbeat. Beside her, standing close enough that his shoulder occasionally brushed the fabric of her sleeve, Silas was peeling apples. The only other sound in the room was the methodical hiss of his knife against the fruit and the distant, mournful whistle of the wind as it scoured the dry plains outside. They had lived in this cabin together for 4 months now, a matter of cold survival after the fever had swept through the valley and left them both standing in the wreckage of 2 different lives. There was no romance in their arrangement, only the practical necessity of shared heat and divided labor. 2 tired souls who had found a temporary harbor in one another's silence. Silas moved with a deliberate, quiet grace, his large hands careful with the paring knife, his gaze fixed entirely on the task at hand. He was a man who carried the heavy, unspoken weight of a life spent in the shadows of mistakes he couldn't undo. And Martha was a woman who had simply run out of tears, her grief having hardened into a quiet, steady resolve to keep moving. The light shifted, deepening from gold to a burnt sienna as the sun dipped toward the jagged teeth of the western range. Silas finished the last apple and set it in the bowl, the wood clinking softly against the table. He didn't move away. He stayed there, his presence a warm, solid weight in the dimming room. He reached for a damp cloth and began to wipe the peels from the table, his movement slow so as not to disturb the rhythm of her kneading. Martha didn't look up, but she felt the air change as he leaned closer to reach a stray piece of skin near her hand. The smell of him was always the same: cedar smoke, old denim, and the faint metallic tang of the cold outside. It was a scent that had become her anchor, a familiar geography in a world that had become unrecognizable. "The oven is hot enough," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Martha nodded, her breath hitching slightly in the stillness. "I'll have the tins ready in a moment." He stepped toward the cast-iron stove, the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards sounding like a muffled drum. He adjusted the damper, the metal creaking and complaining in the heat. The room was growing darker now, the shadows stretching long and distorted against the rough-hewn log walls. Silas lit a small kerosene lamp, the match flare casting a sudden flickering yellow light that danced across Martha's tired features. He watched her for a beat, not with the gaze of a man searching for something, but with the steady, unblinking recognition of a person watching a fire burn down to its embers. He saw the way her shoulders slumped, the fine lines of white flour marking the creases of her apron, and the way she pushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead with the back of a powdered hand. He walked back to the table and reached out, his fingers catching the stray lock of hair she had missed. He tucked it behind her ear, a gesture so natural and unstudied that neither of them moved to acknowledge it. His skin was warm, his touch as light as a falling leaf. Martha paused her kneading for a second, her eyes closing as she leaned almost imperceptibly into the contact. Then the moment passed, and Silas was moving toward the door to check the latch against the rising wind. The evening progressed in a series of small, necessary motions. They ate their meal in the deepening twilight, the only light coming from the lamp and the glowing cracks of the stove. The sound of their forks against the tin plates was a lonely, rhythmic music. Silas watched the way the lamplight reflected in the dark amber of the tea in his cup. He thought of the men he had known in the camps, the loud laughter and the violent outbursts of a life lived on the edge, and he found he couldn't remember why he had ever wanted to be anywhere else but this quiet, dim room. The silence between them wasn't a void, it was a conversation held in the language of proximity. It was the way she knew to refill his coffee without asking, and the way he knew to move the heavy wood box closer to the hearth so she wouldn't have to reach.
"The wind is coming from the north tonight," Silas remarked, his eyes on the window where the glass was beginning to frost at the corners. "It'll be a hard freeze by morning." She rose to clear the plates, her movements stiff. Silas stooped and took them from her hands, his fingers lingering on hers for a heartbeat longer than was required to take the weight of the metal. He walked to the basin and began to wash them, the splash of the water a soft, domestic sound that seemed to push back the vast, indifferent darkness outside. Martha sat back down by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. She watched the silhouette of his broad back against the lamplight. There was a profound safety in the sight of him, a feeling of being shielded by a wall that didn't demand anything in return. She realized, with a start that remained hidden beneath her calm exterior, that she no longer looked at the door with the same frantic hope of seeing someone else. The person who was supposed to be there was gone, and the man who was actually there had become the texture of her life. Silas finished the dishes and dried his hands on a rough sackcloth. He moved to the hearth and sat in the chair opposite her, his long legs stretched out towards the heat. He pulled a piece of leather from his pocket and a small awl, beginning to mend a tear in a harness strap. The rhythmic piercing of the leather and the soft hiss of the thread through the holes became the heartbeat of the room. Martha took up a basket of mending, her needle moving in and out of the heavy wool with a steady, hypnotic grace. They sat this way for an hour, the light from the fire dancing in orange flickers across the ceiling. The air in the cabin grew warmer, the smell of baked bread finally beginning to permeate the space, sweet and heavy. It was the scent of a home, a scent that didn't belong to the wandering life Silas had led for a decade. He looked at Martha, her head bowed over her work, the firelight catching the silver threads in her hair. He felt a sudden sharp pang of something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sorrow, but a heavy, meaningful blend of both. It was the realization that he was no longer waiting for the next thing. He was already in it. "I fixed the latch on the cellar door today," his voice barely more than a murmur. Martha nodded, her breath hitching slightly in the stillness. "Thank you. It's been rattling for weeks." "Won't rattle no more." They went back to their tasks. The wind outside rose to a howl, throwing grit against the logs, but inside, the world was small and golden. Silas watched the way Martha's breathing had slowed, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful, rhythmic draw. She looked tired, bone-deep tired, but the sharp, jagged edges of her grief seemed to have been rounded off by the steady daily presence of their routine. He thought about the trail he had intended to take when the spring came, the mountains to the west that had always called his name, and he realized the call had grown faint, drowned out by the sound of a kettle whistling and the quiet breathing of the woman across from him. The bread was finished. Silas rose and took the tins from the oven, the heat billowing out in a dry, fragrant cloud. He set them on the cooling rack, his movements careful and practiced. Martha stood and walked over to look at them, her shoulder brushing his as she leaned in. She didn't move away. She stayed there, the warmth of him radiating through her clothes, a solid, unmoving shore. "They turned out well," she said softly. "They did." He turned toward her, the space between them narrow and full of the scent of yeast and wood smoke. He could see the pulse in her neck, the steady, fragile beat of a life that had endured. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he rested it on the small of her back. He didn't pull her closer, and he didn't move to kiss her. He simply held his hand there, a quiet, physical anchoring. Martha leaned her head back against his shoulder, her eyes closing as she let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of a person finally putting down a heavy load. The fire burned down to a deep, glowing bed of coals. The lamp flickered and went out, leaving the room in a soft, red-tinted darkness. Silas didn't move to relight it. He led her back to the chairs by the hearth, and they sat down together, closer this time. The only light came from the dying embers, casting a dim, flickering glow over the room. The silence was absolute now, the wind having died down to a low, melodic moan in the eaves. Martha felt the exhaustion finally claiming her. Her head felt heavy, her eyelids impossible to keep open. She shifted in her chair, her arm touching his, the rough denim of his sleeve a comforting texture against her skin. She didn't think about the past, and she didn't wonder about the morning. She only knew the heat of the fire and the steady, quiet presence of the man beside her.
Silas watched her as she began to drift. He saw the way her chin dipped toward her chest and the way her hand, resting on the arm of the chair, went limp. He didn't move to go to his own bed. He stayed in the chair, his gaze fixed on the fading red of the coals. He felt a profound sense of arrival, a feeling that the long, dusty road he had been traveling for years had finally ended in this dim, warm room. He wasn't Silas the drifter anymore. He was just a man, keeping watch over a woman's sleep. Martha stirred in her sleep, her head tilting until it came to rest against Silas's shoulder. She didn't wake. She simply adjusted to the new support, her breathing deepening as she settled into the warmth of him. Silas sat perfectly still, his heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. He reached out with his forehand and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the back of the chair, draping it over both of them with a silent, careful tenderness. The room grew colder as the fire died, but beneath the blanket, the heat of their bodies created a small, private world. Martha moved her hand in her sleep, her fingers finding the edge of Silas's sleeve and holding on, a quiet, instinctive tether. Silas leaned his head back against the wood of the chair and closed his eyes. He didn't speak, and he didn't move to leave. He simply stayed there, his arm pressed against hers, his breath matching the timing of hers in the dark. The frost continued to bloom across the windows, etching silver patterns in the night. The cabin was a small, silent island in the middle of a vast, frozen sea. Inside, the two of them sat unmoving, anchored to one another by the simple, heavy truth of their proximity. Silas felt the weight of her head on his shoulder and the grip of her hand on his sleeve, and he realized that the choice had already been made, not in words or in grand gestures, but in the quiet, daily act of staying. He didn't move to lay her down or to go to his loft. He remained in the chair, his presence a quiet, unyielding wall against the cold, watching the last ember turn to gray ash. Martha's grip on his sleeve tightened just a fraction in her sleep, and she didn't let go.